Hi, I'm Amy.
And I'm Kirsty.
And this is our podcast covering the highs, lows, and realities of parenting a child with neurodiversity.
Each week we'll be sharing updates from our lives and hearing from a variety of guests about their advice and experiences.
This is Love Needs No Words.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Love Needs No Words. This week we are joined by Megan McEwan. Meghan is an NHS Counselling Psychologist and throughout her career has worked with many neurodivergent children and young people and subsequently has got a real insight to so many of the challenges that they're facing both prior to and post-diagnosis. What struck me when I first spoke to Meghan was just how passionate she was for promoting the mental health and well-being of young people who are neurodivergent. She is an absolute advocate for early access to support and the difference that this can make. Hi, Meghan.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, no, our
Thanks
pleasure.
for coming on.
So I think a good place to start is because there's so many different kind of psychologists and roles and such like, it might be helpful, I think, for people who are sort of unsure about what a counselling psychologist is. Can you share with us a little bit about the role that you're currently doing?
Okay, so counselling psychologists are very similar to clinical psychologists, but I think a slight difference is that whilst we focus on using evidence-based therapies, we take a really humanistic approach. It's a very relational approach working with service users. So our focus a lot of the time is on really building a strong bond with our clients and being as supportive as possible. Not that clinical psychologists don't, they do. But I think in some areas of clinical psychology, depending on where you're working, it can be very regimented and structured just because of the way that the treatment protocols work. So, yeah, I mean, I guess that's the main difference. So what do I do? Well, a whole myriad of different things, really, because I work in the NHS. So it depends on, I guess, which team you work in. I might be delivering therapy. I might be doing assessments. I might be doing, like, for instance, a cognitive assessment, or I might be doing an ADOS, so diagnosing autism or ADHD. I'm going into schools to do consultations, or I might be doing a lot of parent work. We do parent workshops, a lot of psychoeducation to support teachers and parents and the wider network as well. And then I provide more of an outreach kind of support where I'll go into the school and work with the child so that when they're in a place where they can access that therapeutic provision,
Right.
because they're more regulated, and kind of reinforce those strategies that have been put in place and introduce new ones, and also act as, I guess, a liaison and a support reflective space for the teachers in the mainstream schools.
Oh, so important.
You're talking about the bond that you have to build with these young people, and I can imagine that takes time and a lot of sort of consistency. How do you find that works? Like, do you go in quite consistently to the same settings? Do you have the opportunity to be able to do that?
Consistency is key, and we tend to. So, with the population that I'm working with, there's their social and emotional mental health framework and understanding. So, we use a kind of trauma informed principles, really. So, consistency is one of the most important things. A lot of research shows that actually the best outcomes come from the client's goals. But when you're working with young children that are quite dysregulated, they're quite disorientated, they don't really know what their goals are a lot of the time. But they can identify maybe what's not working, and they might be able to identify a little bit about, what they might like to change. So I can work with that, and usually I'll use like the PACE model. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that: playfulness, acceptance, compassion, and empathy. So being really playful, we do a lot of play using mentalizing approaches. So looking at overall stabilizing again, using play to help regulate the young person. And then when they're in that space where they can mentalize, so perspective take and think about other people's points of view as well as their own, and mentalize themselves as well, and mentalize what they might be thinking and feeling, because that can be very difficult for them as well. And then kind of reflecting and then going back to regulating. So it's almost like a sandwich, the regulation, then a little bit of kind of perspective taking, thinking, about thoughts and feelings, and then
Mm.
more regulating, and then back to class.
Because when you were talking about trauma, I can imagine that quite a few, or a majority of the children and young people that you're working with have probably gone through various different trauma experiences, whether it be educational, um, or various different situations. So presumably that's where the trauma kind of approach that you take comes in.
Yeah, I think, and also trauma can be different to different people. How
Mm.
people experience a situation as being traumatic can be very different depending on where you come from, your lived experience, your cultural perspective, a number of different things. Young people who are neurodiverse can experience things quite keenly, whether it's through their sensory needs or whether it's how they might interpret social situations. So I think you have to have in the back of your mind the whole time, what is this person's experience? How might have events kind of resonated for them or caused them to take a certain direction? And how might we unpick that in a way that is sort of as supportive as possible?
Does the timeline that you're working with them for change dependent on who it is?
This is the thing, when you're in an NHS setting, usually you're expected to work to a certain model, whether it's a 6-session model or a 12-session model.
Sure.
But when you're working with attachment-based difficulties, again, coming back to consistency is key,
Yeah.
and longevity is really important as well. But if the young person was neurodiverse, then it could be extended to a 20-session model. But then if you've got a young person that has experienced a lot of neglect, maybe you've got an adolescent. On one occasion, I had an adolescent who begged me to go into foster care, and of course, that wasn't possible. But they would be coming to session hungry, dirty. Therapy might have been the space for them that was kind of the safe space. So
Yeah, that's hard, isn't it?
I did see them for longer than I should have, but
Yeah. In that
I sort of
situation, it was
felt it
appropriate to
was,
do so.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. It's when it's clinically appropriate to
Yes.
continue. It's difficult because it's a valuable resource, and there are lots of people waiting to use that resource.
Yeah,
So
I can only imagine. I can only imagine the
Mm.
amount of, we've had the privilege of speaking to various different people throughout doing this podcast journey, where they've struggled with mental health and various different situations because of experiences that they've had pre-diagnosis. Often is the kind of common theme that's come out of this. We were
mm,
talking, Megan, when I was first talking to you about your sort of passion for working with young girls specifically and teenagers, who we know is a big focus at the moment, especially on kind of the numbers of late diagnosis in females. You've obviously worked with many of that kind of population. What's the impact of late diagnosis that you've noticed through your work?
well, I think it can be devastating because at the end of the day, if you think of those kind of tender years of adolescence where you're forming self-concept, and you're constantly feeling different from others, and then the people around you are saying, "No, you're not different. You just need to get your act together," or you're receiving mental health support, but somehow it's just not working for you, and you can't quite figure out why. For instance, if we take the example of autistic burnout, like many autistic girls are driven to do well, the high levels of perfectionism. They maybe don't have that awareness of when they need to drink and eat. They forget to do that. They may struggle if things aren't just right. Everything in their room is not just right. It's hard for them to relax and to manage. So if they have an awareness that, oh, okay, if I drink and if I eat at certain times, if I put a timer on my phone to make sure that I give myself that sustenance, if I make sure that I spend 2 or 3 hours a day by myself, recharging my social battery, those sorts of things can make a
Mm.
huge difference to help support them so that, they're not constantly on that, what's the word, hamster wheel,
Yeah.
essentially,
Yeah.
trying to achieve those things that they want to be perfect. And also then they can question, oh, okay, so maybe it's because I need things to be just right. How can I suppose, isolate aspects of my life so that they're just right, so that I can manage with the uncertainty of situations when things aren't just right,
Mm.
because I know I can come back to a certain space that is just right for me. That sort of thing.
So from what I'm kind of hearing from that is that it really gives them the opportunity to empower themselves to take control of those things. And like one thing I've really learned with autism and through my son is actually that control is really important to him. And when he isn't in control,
Mm.
that's when he really struggles.
Yeah, and so it's just having that understanding, isn't it? That he
Mm.
might need to be in control. What can he be in control of? It might be that he has a little box of things that he has to do, that when he's in a situation where there's a lot of uncertainty, he can sit with that box and line things up in the box as a means of that's just a random example plucked from the air, but there are lots of different strategies that you can put in place, which are not about how I need to change my mind
Yeah.
to fit with a neurotypical world, and are more about how can I soothe myself? How can I regulate myself in situations that I find challenging?
Mm.
Because we all have situations that we find challenging. And I guess we all have little coping strategies that we put in place.
Mm.
Um, but yeah, sometimes people need more support in finding those coping strategies.
Yeah, absolutely. We were talking, weren't we, about the sort of positives in the upsurge in awareness um,
Yeah.
around neurodiversity. And obviously, there's a lot in the news at the moment about that. And you were sort of saying, Megan, that you're quite an advocate in actually this being a real positive.
Yeah, I think so. I think there's a lot of debate around the upsurge and diagnosis generally, isn't there? And there's also a BBC Sounds podcast where Susan O'Sullivan, who is also a consultant neurologist, explores what she believes to be a kind of an explosion in diagnosis. And I guess she asks the question, if we know a lot about these things, does it become a self-fulfilling prophecy? And I guess her argument is that, again, when it comes back to resources, there are people with children who are autistic who might have a lot of needs. And in some way, her argument is that those children aren't getting the support they need because there's been this sudden explosion of people who've been diagnosed with autism. But I don't think actually that that's correct, because services do tend to triage and look at the level of impairment and the level of need,
Yeah.
and make sure that they allocate the resource in line with that. I think for me, what's more important is that somebody can go, oh, okay, that's the reason why I'm experiencing this. That's the reason why I might find, I don't know, for instance, going on public transport challenging.
Mm.
And how can I manage going on public transport? What can I do? What can I put in place to support myself with
Mm.
going on public transport? If you think about modern life and how it is now, I mean, for all of us, it's challenging. There are so many different layers that we have to negotiate to live our daily lives. And for someone who's neurodiverse, it's sort of doubly overwhelming, I think. So
Mm.
again, it comes back to okay, so this person has a diagnosis, but you can't see on the outside that they might be struggling inside. That doesn't mean that they're not finding things difficult.
And I suppose in some ways, having an earlier diagnosis and then having access that we all do to so many resources these days, through the internet, through social media, at some point, you would hope that someone would be able to access that information and be able to, educate themselves and be able to support themselves with some of these coping strategies before it gets to those points of trauma that then end up, with yourselves and people, in your role having to then intervene and support further when trauma's already happened. Wouldn't it be better if we were in a situation where that trauma never happened in the first place because of our
Yeah,
awareness?
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. But there's also, I'm just going to go on from there because I'm thinking of some of the young people I worked with in my last role, which was in a tier 3 service. So that's for moderate to severe mental health difficulties. And some of the young people I worked with autism, in terms of the therapeutic provision, a lot of it was just about making sense of the world and having that space to talk things through and make sense of how things worked and problem solve. So I guess we need to be aware that if somebody has a diagnosis of autism, they need that extra thinking space. So therefore they should have access to services
Mm.
because it will help them function better on a daily basis.
Mm.
And for that, it's a small price to pay, really. I would work with young people who would, would be coming up to their A levels and they would just be overwhelmed by the competing demands of all of their workload. And I'd really just be helping them make sense of how to prioritize what to do next, or maybe helping them think about, well, how might you say to the teacher and go and talk to the teacher about, because they might be fearful about talking to the teacher. So ultimately, it might seem like, well, why is a psychologist doing that? That should be something a parent should be doing. But parents have quite a lot to do when they have a neurodivergent child already, or a neurodiverse child already. So if a psychologist or a kind of a third party, a neutral third party is there to give them that reflective space so that they can then have that independence to go and do what they need to do in the world, then I think that can only be a positive thing.
I think it works across the board with all services as well, because my son has speech and language therapy, and some of the techniques that she teaches me seem so obvious when you hear it, but we need that guidance, we need that support. And sometimes, yeah, they could be the simplest of things that can make such a massive difference, but you can get so lost in it all that just having someone with that level of experience to come in and guide you to guide them, just it means everything in that moment.
It's interesting, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, because I think there are some things we as adults do automatically. We do it automatically because we've had years of practice.
Mm.
Um, but then equally, as you're saying, Amy, when you're as a parent, if you're also in the process and there's so many different things happening, it can be, yeah, really supportive to have somebody to come in and go, okay, well, let's just take this back to basics. We'll just do this really simply. And it can really help because there's so much that is, there are so many different directions you could take, and sometimes simplicity is best.
One of the things that Amy and I have spoken about, and we've found on the journey that we've been on up to now, is both our children have diagnoses, but we've accessed very little post-diagnosis support through the NHS. And one thing that kind of came through from speaking to you, Megan, was that you have a real passion for improving post-diagnosis support. What's driven that for you? Because for us, that's been a real gap.
I think it is because I keep talking about my other services. The last service I was in was a diagnostic service, and I would be giving the diagnosis, and sometimes the families would be quite surprised at the fact that their child was autistic, or or they might have ADHD as well, or they might have ADHD, and they really didn't know a lot about the condition and how to support the condition. And we did provide them with a post diagnostic pack with lots of signposting to local resources. But actually, quite a few of our parents were also neurodiverse but didn't know that they were neurodiverse. So it might be difficult for them to, I don't know, to read that information, to absorb that information. It was sent electronically. They might not have access to a computer. They might just have a little phone that they're sharing as a family. So they might not have time to go through all that and contact, or they might be a single parent who's working 5 or 6 days a week.
Mm.
So they don't have time to access or be that person that goes and looks at all the different charities and finds when the webinars and all of those kind of things are. So what we did do as a team was we thought about how we could support more with immediately after the diagnosis, and we did like little slideshows that went through talking about the neurodiversity umbrella and co-occurring conditions, and thinking about mental health and neurodiversity, and thinking about the different diagnostic criteria and what that might look like, and going through with them perhaps the parent interview and making a more of a kind of a unique profile for their child, because there is no one type of autism, and there are lots of different areas, and same for ADHD as well. It is completely unique to the individual. So that was just a little bit of extra time. We were given not much time to give the diagnosis, so it might kind of expand a little in terms of how much time we had allocated. But I did leave those phone call sessions, or those kind of online sessions, thinking I want to be able to give them a little bit more.
Yeah.
I want them to have time to think about what they've just heard and what it means for their child, and then to be able to come back later and ask questions. It's not possible in the boroughs that we're in, but interestingly, I know across the UK, Scotland and Wales offer post-diagnostic support. So it does feel like it would be helpful in the future, I think, in England and Northern Ireland maybe to offer that as an option. What I would say is that there are some amazing agencies that parents can go to. Have you heard of Contact, the charity for families with disabled children? They're very good. They give all sorts of advice for families with disabled children around benefits. They offer a service called the Listening Ear, where you get an hour-long one-to-one telephone appointment with a family support advisor. Autism Central and obviously the National Autistic Society is a really good resource.
When we got our diagnosis, actually, we were told quite honestly, I suppose, by the paediatrician that the support that we would be able to access wouldn't be through the NHS. We would need to reach out to various different charities, and that was kind of the end of any post-diagnosis support that we received. And I think, Amy, I speak on behalf of you, that actually, I mean, where we live locally to us, there's some fantastic charities that do all sorts of brilliant things and really support families. But I think the challenge that I've seen is that actually it's really overwhelming trying to access that information and knowing where to go and what to look for, because you don't always know what you're dealing with. That's the thing, we're not professionals necessarily. We're all on a bit of a learning journey with this, and so it's hard to necessarily know where to look and what you're looking for. I think that's been a real eye-opener for me, and it might seem really obvious to if you've gone through the journey and you've learnt it, and that's why certain social media accounts are so helpful, because they've got older children and they've been through it and they can share those experiences, or once you access these charities, they can provide it. But it's really difficult in the early days when you've got a young child. You're learning how to be a parent, and then you're learning how to be a parent of a neurodiverse child as well.
Yeah.
Wouldn't it be wonderful if there was just a little bit more support out there? Because
Yeah.
like you said, every young person has a different profile, has different needs, different support. So yeah, sometimes it feels like you're just kind of on that hamster wheel that you identified right at the beginning.
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because if you have a child diagnosed with a condition like neurofibromatosis or diabetes, you would have access to a psychologist maybe for 6 sessions, with devising strategies and with thinking about how, you might function, and also making sense of that diagnosis and what it means for you. But yeah, with autism, we don't in England and Northern Ireland. And no, it can have a massive impact. And also ADHD. I keep forgetting to mention ADHD, but that can be, quite a difficult condition to live with. And that whole thing with ADHD, to medicate, not to medicate,
Yeah.
personal family beliefs around medication, worries and fears that how might this affect my child? Will it change my child's personality? All of these questions come up. You might get a short amount of time with a clinical nurse specialist or a psychiatrist to discuss all of those worries. But with autism, because you're not medicating, you don't get any contact with a professional aside from when you're given the diagnosis.
And for many families, I think I, for one, went into the diagnosis 99% sure on that day that I was going to get a diagnosis, and off the back of that, felt assured that I'd be able to get him the support that he needed, and then was given this bulk of leaflets, which, I did take the time to read through, but I remember I got in the car, I read through the first one and just broke down,
Wow.
because even though I knew that the likelihood was he was going to get that diagnosis, even I was completely overwhelmed with all of these forms and leaflets, and how am I going to go through this all? Well, I need to look up each of these
Mm.
websites. And so what you offered there, that space to maybe just go through a few of them, just saying to your clients, look, you don't have to do any of this for a minute. Just focus on these three things. And what I'll do is I'll call you in a week's time and we'll talk it all through. I mean, I'm not speaking for everyone listening, but I'm sure a lot of us would have done anything that day to have just had a bit more of a debrief with somebody, and then the reassurance that we could speak to them again in a week's time.
Absolutely. I mean, it is a massive thing to hear because it's sort of, as you say, even if you expect that result, it's a fork in the road, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's a different journey that your life and your child's life is going to take. Yeah, so you need time to process that and then come back with the questions when you're ready to think about that.
And also, it's not one of those situations where the pediatrician or health professional can say to you, this is what's going to happen in a few years. There's no answer to that.
Mm.
It's like, look, we're just going to have to play this out and see. And that's really scary as well.
And when you think about the co-occurring conditions with autism and ADHD, anxiety, and or perhaps OCD or depression,
Mm.
and all of those things as a parent that you might be experiencing, wondering about the what ifs, what might happen for them. Some of those things, it would be helpful to have that professional support to make sense of, well, this is perhaps just a feature of the condition. And so when the young person is experiencing anxiety and expressing it, you can just go with it. You can explore
Yes.
with them why they might be anxious. Whereas, as a parent who hasn't had that support, you might think, oh gosh, they're anxious. How can I make them feel better?
Mm.
What can I do to make them feel better? When actually just talking about it makes it feel better.
Yeah, and I think from Amy and I's perspective as well, we have young children, we've got a diagnosis very early, so our children haven't really been part of that diagnosis journey. But obviously, you've got families who are going through this as parents and children together. The child will be, or young person will be old enough to understand why they're going through an assessment and what that looks like. To have that support to be able to provide to both child, young person and parent would be absolutely invaluable, I would imagine, because Amy and I have come at it from a very young age with our children. We haven't really had to navigate that process of our children's emotions as part of it, but other parents will have had to have gone through that, answering questions, trying to process it themselves and go on that journey, and also support their child as well.
Mm.
Yeah, definitely.
In terms of sort of, I guess, for those young people who are older than our boys, self-management obviously is, you know, imperative, and presumably there's kind of strategies and therapies that you provide in your role, and can be provided to young people but also to parents. What kind of things can parents look into to support their child through this journey?
The autism color wheel looks at different areas of functioning. So, sensory processing, emotional regulation, social skills, speech, stimming, nonverbal communication, depression, need for routine, meltdowns, anxiety, and executive functions, and motor skills. The child can get an individual picture of where their strengths and weaknesses are, and then you can put the strategies in place based on that. So, for instance, a need for routine might be that's quite a straightforward one. You just have your routine every day, and on the days that you know it's going to be challenging, find a way to introduce a little bit of routine. Say you're going on a car journey. Well, we're going to go to this service station and stick to that. That you're going to stop at that service station. From my experience, autism is very top down, it's very head. That's why sometimes it's really hard to identify what you're feeling or what your needs might be, because you might be pursuing your interests and that might be what you know is
It's
keeping you
driving you.
going.
Yeah.
Yeah, And actually, your bodily needs or your bodily functions are just annoying because you're pursuing your interests. I'd much rather drive this car up and down repetitively than, have to stop to go to the toilet or have to stop to eat. And there are other resources out there too. I mean, I would actually say that an occupational therapist should be one of your ports of call if possible, because so many of the challenges associated with autism are linked to the body, understanding the body, how the body moves through space, sensory needs, those kind of things.
That's really good advice. Not one that's easy to access, an occupational therapist.
Really not. Yeah, they're like gold dust.
They are.
Really, yeah.
That was the exact term I was thinking when you were speaking.
Yeah. Yeah.
I just wanted to know, Megan, what would you say is the best part about working with neurodivergent individuals? And is there sort of a moment that sticks out to you during your time working with them so far?
Well, I really love working with children with Gestalt language processing. So they tend to kind of like go veering off and they have their own special language and it's all about riffing. And I love that. One of the things they talk about in mentalizing is marked mirroring. So that's being with the person and mirroring what they're doing. And it's just lovely if they're kind of, I don't know, we're talking about what's the Minecraft movie? What's that one? Chicken Jockey. You know, you'll have a young person who's going chicken jockey, and you'll be going chicken jockey, and you'll both be kind of like.
Love that.
I do love doing that kind of thing. That's a lot of fun. But also, what is really refreshing about older neurodiverse teenagers, for instance, or adolescents, is the depth that they will go into in discussing subjects, or how you might. What I really like is how you might come alongside somebody and, they might have a specialist interest. They might have something that they really love, and how you can make that part of the therapeutic process. So speaking their language, there's a sort of a famous Carl Rogers saying, which is that people are like sunsets. There's no one sunset that is the same. So, yeah.
Oh, that's
Oh,
beautiful.
I love that.
Phrase. I've never heard that before.
Love that phrase. I'm going to use that all the
People
time.
are like
now.
sunsets. Oh,
That made me laugh about Gestalt language processing because Alex has just started to say words, and in the bath earlier he was going Preston, which is from a program he watches. So me, his dad, and Isabel, his sister, were all going Preston. It's like the whole
So much
house, all
fun.
you could hear was everyone going Preston. It's like we're joining with you, mate. That's great.
we're here with you. Oh, thank you so much, Megan. Such a fascinating topic, and I can only imagine how interesting your work is and the variety. I don't think I realised how much variety there was in what you do. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you, and the impact you're having. So thank you.
Absolutely.